The world came back in fragments, light first, sharp and merciless, slicing through her eyelids like glass. Then sound, distant and warped, voices bending over her, rising and falling in urgency she couldn't quite grasp. Elena Carter tried to breathe, but the air felt wrong, too thin, like her lungs had forgotten how to pull it in properly. Something wet clung to her skin, cold and heavy, and when she shifted even slightly, a bolt of pain tore through her abdomen so violently that it dragged a broken gasp from her throat. "Stay with me, ma'am, can you hear me?" The voice hovered somewhere above her, but Elena couldn't find it, couldn't hold on to it. Everything was slipping, sliding sideways into darkness again. She blinked hard, forcing her eyes open for a second, and all she saw were fluorescent lights blurring into streaks, the sterile white of a hospital ceiling rushing past as the gurney rattled beneath her. Her hands twitched weakly against the sides, but they felt foreign, disconnected, like they belonged to someone else. She tried to speak, to ask what was happening, to say something, anything, but her tongue was thick, her lips barely moving. The only thing she managed was a shallow, broken inhale that burned all the way down. "BP's dropping. Get her into trauma now. She's losing too much blood." Blood, the word echoed, slow and distant, as if it had to travel miles to reach her. Elena turned her head slightly, and that was when she saw it, dark red soaking through the thin fabric of her dress, spreading in uneven, horrifying patterns. It didn't feel real. None of this did. Just moments ago was it moments. She had been walking, just walking, trying to get somewhere, anywhere that wasn't that house, that life, that suffocating silence that had been pressing in on her for months. Now there were hands everywhere. Gloves, cold instruments, someone cutting fabric, someone pressing down too hard, forcing a cry from her throat that barely sounded human. "Ma'am, we need you to stay with us. What's your name?" Elena tried to answer. Her mind reached for it automatically, the simplest truth, the thing that should have been easiest to say. But even that felt far away, buried under layers of pain and panic. Elena," it came out fractured, barely audible. "Good, Elena, stay with me. Do you have anyone we can call?" The question floated in the air, heavy and expectant, and for a moment everything inside her went completely still. "Anyone?" Her mind reached instinctively for a name, for a face, for someone who would come running, someone who would push through these doors and demand answers, someone who would care enough to show up. But there was nothing. No parents, no close friends, no one she trusted anymore, and the one person who should have been there, the man whose name she carried, whose house she lived in, whose life she had been trapped inside, wasn't even an option. He wouldn't come, not for this, not for her. A hollow emptiness spread through her chest, colder than the blood soaking her skin. "No one," she tried to say, but it came out as a whisper lost in the chaos. "Ma'am, we need an emergency contact." The nurse pressed gently, leaning closer, her voice softer now, almost kind. Elena's vision flickered again, darkness creeping in at the edges. She could feel herself slipping, feel the thin thread holding her here starting to fray. Panic surged, weak but desperate. Not like this. Not alone. Not without. And then from somewhere deep, from a place she had locked away and refused to touch for years, a name surfaced. It hit her with the force of memory and regret, and something dangerously close to hope. No. Her mind recoiled instantly. Not him, anyone but him. But there was no one else. The truth settled in with brutal clarity. There had never been anyone else. Not really. Not like him. Her fingers curled weakly against the sheet as she forced her lips to move again. It took everything she had left to push the sound out, to give voice to something she had buried 3 years ago and sworn never to speak again. "Raphael." The nurse leaned closer. What was that? Elena swallowed, pain flaring, her breath hitching as the darkness pressed harder, pulling her under. Raphael Morty. The name seemed to change the air itself, even in that small, chaotic space. It felt heavier, sharper, like something that didn't belong in a place like this, something dangerous. The nurse froze for half a second, just long enough for uncertainty to flicker across her face. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly, as if the question mattered more than it should. Elena didn't have the strength to answer again. Her eyes were already closing, her body giving in to the pull of unconsciousness. But somewhere inside, the decision had already been made. If she was going to disappear, If this was the end of whatever fragile life she had left, she wouldn't do it completely alone. The nurse hesitated only a moment longer before turning to the station, her fingers moving quickly as she searched for the number, her expression tightening as recognition slowly dawned. Then, after a brief pause that felt heavier than it should have, she made the call. Across the room, the machines continued their steady, urgent rhythm. Doctors moved faster, orders were shouted, blood was prepared. The world fought to keep Elena Carter alive. But somewhere beyond those hospital walls, something far more dangerous had just been set in motion. Because she hadn't called for help. She had called for him. The phone didn't ring twice. It didn't even complete the first full vibration before it was answered, the line snapping open with a quiet, controlled breath that carried more authority than most men could summon in a lifetime. Somewhere high above the city, inside a room designed for silence and power, Raphael Morty stood at the edge of a long glass table, the skyline of Chicago stretching out behind him like something he owned rather than something he lived in. Around him, voices were mid-sentence, men in tailored suits and guarded expressions discussing numbers, shipments, territories, until his hand lifted, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough. The room fell silent instantly, like someone had cut the sound from the world. He didn't look at them when he spoke into the phone. He didn't need to. "Say that again," he said, his voice low, precise, the kind of calm that only existed when something inside it was already breaking. On the other end, the nurse hesitated just long enough for it to register, for the smallest flicker of fear to travel through the line. "She's been brought into the ER, critical condition. She gave your name as her emergency contact." There was a pause, a breath, and then the words that changed everything. "Elena Carter." For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. The city continued outside the glass. The clock on the wall ticked. The men around the table waited, unsure if they should breathe. Then Raphael closed his eyes and something inside him shifted, something old and buried and carefully controlled snapping loose without warning. When he opened them again, the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. "Which hospital?" he asked. No hesitation, no disbelief, no questions about why, just action, always action. By the time the call ended, the meeting no longer existed. Papers were left where they were, deals unfinished, decisions suspended mid-thought. Raphael didn't explain himself, didn't offer excuses, didn't acknowledge the disruption. He simply turned and walked out, and the men who worked for him, men who had seen violence, power, fear, stepped out of his way without being told. In the hallway, his pace didn't change, but everything around him moved faster. Phones came out. Orders were given in quiet, urgent tones. Cars were called before he reached the elevator. Security was already mobilizing by the time the doors slid open. No one asked why. They didn't need to. They had heard the name. 3 years. That was how long it had been since Elena Carter had vanished from his world, leaving behind nothing but silence and questions he had chosen not to chase. Not because he couldn't find her. He could find anyone. But because he understood something about himself that few people ever did. If he went after her, if he put his hands back on something he had once considered his, he would not let go again. And whatever she had wanted when she left, whatever freedom she had chosen, it wouldn't survive that. So he had let her go, not peacefully, not easily, but completely, until now. The elevator doors opened to the underground garage, and the moment Raphael stepped out, the atmosphere shifted again. Engines were already running, black cars idling in perfect formation like something rehearsed, something inevitable. The driver didn't speak as Raphael slid into the back seat. He didn't need directions. The destination had already been transmitted, confirmed, locked into place. Doors slammed in sequence, precise and controlled, and within seconds the convoy was moving, slipping out into the night with a speed that ignored the normal rules of the city. Inside the car, Raphael didn't move. His hands rested loosely on his knees, his posture relaxed in a way that would have looked almost calm to anyone who didn't know him. But his eyes, dark, focused, completely present, were fixed on something far beyond the passing lights. Elena Carter. The name echoed in his mind, pulling with it memories he had never allowed himself to revisit. Her voice, steady and intelligent. The way she had looked at him without fear. The way she had walked away without looking back. He had respected that, more than he should have, more than was wise. And now she had called him. Not her husband, not a friend, not anyone safe or normal or expected, him. That meant something had gone wrong. Not small wrong, not manageable wrong. The kind of wrong that stripped everything down to instinct, to truth, to the one name you trusted even when you knew you shouldn't. The car accelerated, weaving through traffic with controlled aggression, and the rest of the convoy followed like shadows. Phones buzzed with updates, locations confirmed, hospital staff identified, security weaknesses mapped in real time. By the time they reached the ER, Raphael already knew everything that could be known without being inside the room with her. Critical condition, blood loss, emergency surgery pending, no next of kin present. Alone. The word settled into him like something heavy and unforgivable. The hospital came into view, its bright emergency entrance glowing against the dark like a beacon for people who still believed help came from places like this. The first car didn't slow as much as it should have. It didn't need to. By the time the doors opened, people were already moving out of the way, drawn by something they couldn't quite name but instinctively understood. Presence, power, danger. Raphael stepped out and the air changed. Inside, conversations faltered. Nurses paused mid-step. A security guard straightened without knowing why. No one had been told who he was. No one needed to be. There was something about him that made explanations unnecessary. He walked through the sliding doors without breaking stride, his gaze scanning once, calculating, locating. A nurse at the desk looked up, her voice catching before she could finish her practiced greeting. "Sir, you." "I'm here for Alina Carter," he said, and there was nothing loud about it, nothing aggressive, but it landed like a command. The nurse froze, recognition flashing too late across her face. And for the first time that night, the hospital stopped being a place of routine emergencies and controlled chaos. Because something far more dangerous had just walked in. The double doors to the surgical wing swung shut with a soft, final click that seemed louder than it should have been, sealing Alina Carter somewhere beyond reach, beyond sight, beyond anything Raphael Morty could control with force or influence, and that alone made the air feel wrong. He stood in the middle of the corridor, still as stone, while everything around him moved, nurses rushing past, gurneys rattling, distant voices calling out instructions, but none of it touched him. For the first time in years, he wasn't the center of the storm. He was outside it, waiting, and waiting was something he had never learned to do well. A young doctor approached, hesitant, clearly aware of who or what stood in front of him without fully understanding it. "She's in surgery," he said carefully, choosing each word like it might cost him something. "Internal bleeding, severe complications. We're doing everything we can." Raphael didn't respond immediately. His gaze drifted past the man, through the doors, as if he could will them open, as if sheer focus could bring her back into his line of sight. "Everything you can," he repeated quietly, not as a question, not even as doubt, but as something heavier, something that implied there were limits, and that he did not accept them. The doctor swallowed, nodding quickly, then stepped back without waiting to be dismissed. Silence settled around Raphael, thick and unnatural. His men had spread out without being told, positioning themselves along the hallway near exits at corners, turning the hospital into something else entirely, less a place of healing, more a controlled perimeter. No one challenged it. No one dared. Because even without raised voices or visible weapons, there was an understanding in the air. This was no longer neutral ground. Raphael finally moved, crossing to the large window at the end of the corridor, the city stretching out below in a blur of lights and motion. Chicago had always felt like something he held in his hand, something predictable in its chaos, something he could bend if necessary. But tonight it felt distant, irrelevant. Because for all the power he commanded, all the influence he wielded, he couldn't reach into that operating room and pull her back himself. That helplessness was unfamiliar, and it settled into his chest like a slow-burning pressure. He closed his eyes, and memory came uninvited. Not soft, not gentle, sharp and vivid, like it had been waiting for an excuse to surface. She had stood across from him in this very city, in a room not unlike the one he had left earlier that night, but smaller, quieter, filled with tension that had nothing to do with business. Alina Carter had never belonged in his world, not at first glance. Too calm, too observant, too unwilling to be impressed by power. She had been hired for a simple purpose: translation, communication, bridging gaps between languages and cultures, but she had quickly become something else entirely. She had seen things others missed, patterns, motives, weaknesses, and unlike the men around him, she had spoken her thoughts without fear of consequence. "You're making a mistake," she had said once, her voice steady, her eyes locked on his without hesitation. No deference, no performance, just truth. Most people didn't survive saying something like that to him, but she had. Not because he was lenient, but because she had been right. That had been the beginning. The end had been quieter. No arguments, no confrontation, just absence. One day she was there, present, sharp, impossible to ignore, and the next she was gone. A resignation letter that said nothing. A new name attached to a marriage he had heard about secondhand. A life that had nothing to do with him anymore. He had let it stand. Not because he didn't care, but because he understood something dangerous about himself. If he stepped into that life, if he reached for her again, it wouldn't be temporary. It wouldn't be controlled. It would be absolute. And whatever she had chosen when she left him, whatever peace or safety she thought she was gaining, it would disappear the moment he touched it. So he had stayed away. Until she called his name. Raphael's eyes opened slowly, the reflection in the glass showing a man who looked unchanged but felt something entirely different beneath the surface. She hadn't called lightly. Alina Carter didn't do anything lightly. If she had reached for him now, after everything, after years of silence, then whatever had driven her to it had been stronger than fear, stronger than pride, stronger than the life she had built without him. That meant someone had pushed her there. And that someone had just made a mistake they wouldn't survive. Behind him, footsteps approached, measured and respectful. One of his men stopped at a distance that spoke of habit and caution. "We pulled what we could," he said quietly. "Her husband's been contacted. He's on his way." The word husband settled into the space like something sour. Raphael didn't turn immediately. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make the man behind him shift slightly, uncertain. "Do we know him?" Raphael asked finally. "Yes, Daniel Voss, finance sector, clean on paper, connections in private healthcare." Raphael turned then, slow and deliberate, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharpening in a way that made the air feel thinner. "Private healthcare," he repeated softly, as if testing the words, as if fitting them into something larger. His gaze drifted briefly toward the surgical doors again. "And she ended up here." The implication didn't need to be spoken out loud. Something didn't add up. Raphael took a step forward, then another, the quiet control returning to every movement, every breath. The helplessness was still there, buried deep, but it had already begun to change shape, hardening into something far more familiar. "Resolve. Find out everything," he said, his voice calm, almost detached, which made it far more dangerous than if he had shouted. "Where she's been, who she's been with, what happened before she collapsed. I want timelines, names, decisions, all of it." His man nodded immediately, already turning away to make it happen. Raphael's gaze returned to the closed doors, to the place where Alina Carter was fighting for her life, and for a moment, something almost human crossed his face, something raw and unguarded, gone as quickly as it appeared. 3 years ago, he had let her walk away. Tonight, someone had taken that choice from her. And that changed everything. Time in the corridor didn't move forward so much as it thickened, stretching into something heavy and suffocating, each second dragging across the floor like it was reluctant to pass. The hospital staff tried to return to routine, tried to pretend this was just another emergency, just another night, but the presence of Raphael Morty made that impossible. Every glance lingered too long. Every whispered conversation died too quickly. Even the machines seemed quieter, as if the building itself understood that something far more dangerous than illness had entered its walls. When the surgical doors finally opened, the shift in the air was immediate, like a held breath being released. A doctor stepped out first, older this time, more experienced, the kind of man who had seen enough to mask fear behind professionalism. Still, when his eyes met Raphael's, something flickered there, recognition, caution, the instinctive awareness that whatever he said next mattered more than it should. Raphael didn't move toward him. He didn't need to. The doctor came to him. "She's alive," the man said, and the words should have brought relief, but they landed incomplete, weighted with everything that followed. But it was close, too close. Raphael's gaze didn't soften, but something in his posture shifted, a fraction, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. "Explain," he said. The doctor nodded, glancing briefly at the men positioned along the corridor before lowering his voice, though not enough to hide anything. "Severe internal bleeding. She's been dealing with complications for some time. This didn't start tonight. There was a rupture. We stabilized her, but he hesitated, choosing the next words carefully. She should have been treated earlier. This wasn't sudden. There were warning signs, pain, weakness, symptoms that don't just appear out of nowhere. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sharp-edged, dangerous. Raphael's eyes narrowed slightly. And she wasn't treated, he said, not as a question. The doctor shook his head. Not properly. From what we can tell, she was seen at least once before tonight, possibly more, but whoever handled her case either missed it or ignored it. Ignored it. The word settled like a trigger being pulled without sound. Raphael turned his head slowly, looking back toward the surgical doors, but he wasn't seeing them anymore. He was seeing something else entirely, patterns forming, connections locking into place with the kind of precision that had built his empire. Alina Carter didn't ignore her health. She didn't dismiss pain. She didn't make careless decisions about her own survival. If she had gone to someone and walked away untreated, there was a reason, and reasons like that were rarely innocent. "Is she conscious?" he asked. "Not yet. We've sedated her. She lost a significant amount of blood. She'll wake up eventually, but—" The doctor paused again, and this time there was no way to soften it. "There's something else you should know." Raphael's attention snapped back, sharp and immediate. "Say it." The doctor exhaled slowly, as if bracing himself. "She's pregnant." For a moment the world didn't react. The lights didn't flicker. The hallway didn't shift. Nothing visible changed. But something beneath it all fractured, clean and precise. Raphael didn't speak. The doctor continued, perhaps mistaking the silence for confusion. "Early stage, but not recent. Weeks, maybe longer. The complications tonight, they were directly connected. The stress on her body, the lack of treatment, it all made it worse." Raphael's jaw tightened, a subtle movement that carried more weight than anger ever could. Pregnant. The word echoed, but it didn't land where it should have. It didn't settle into something soft or protective. It moved through him like a calculation, linking itself to everything else he had just learned. She had been sick. She had sought help. And someone had let her walk away like it didn't matter. His gaze shifted, not to the doctor, not to the doors, but somewhere inward where memory and instinct collided. Alina, sitting across from him years ago, arguing logic with a calm certainty. Alina, refusing to be intimidated. Alina, walking away without asking for anything. Alina, now lying unconscious in a hospital bed because someone had decided she wasn't worth saving in time. "Where is she now?" Raphael asked, his voice quieter than before, which made it infinitely more dangerous. "In recovery. We'll be moving her to a private room shortly." "Make sure it's secure." The doctor nodded immediately. "Of course." Raphael stepped past him without waiting for anything else, his men moving in silent coordination as he headed toward the recovery wing. Behind him, the corridor seemed to exhale, tension bleeding out just enough for people to remember how to breathe. But the calm didn't last. Because as he walked, the pieces continued to fall into place. Daniel Voss. Private healthcare connections. A woman with clear symptoms, left untreated. A pregnant woman, sent away until it was almost too late. By the time Raphael reached the recovery floor, the emotion had settled into something colder, something sharper. Not panic, not fear. Understanding. This wasn't an accident. And whoever had made that decision had just crossed a line they didn't even realize existed. He stopped outside the room where Alina lay, the glass window reflecting his image back at him. A man composed, controlled, unchanged to anyone looking from the outside. But beneath that surface, something had already shifted. 3 years ago, he had respected her choice to leave. Tonight, someone had taken her choice away. And that meant they now belonged to him. Fully, completely, irrevocably. Behind the door, machines beeped steadily, keeping her tethered to the world. Outside it, Raphael Morty stood in silence, and for the first time since stepping into the hospital, he allowed himself one truth without filtering it, without control, without restraint. If she had died tonight, the city would have burned. And whoever was responsible still had no idea how close they had come to starting that fire. The elevator doors on the recovery floor opened with a quiet chime that sounded far too calm for the tension already coiled in the air, and when Daniel Voss stepped out, He did so with the confidence of a man who believed problems could be managed if you controlled the narrative quickly enough. His coat was still neatly pressed, his expression arranged into something that resembled concern without fully committing to it, the kind of performance perfected in boardrooms and public statements. He walked with purpose, scanning the hallway for a nurse, a doctor, someone he could speak to, someone who would give him the information he needed before the situation grew beyond his reach. What he did not expect, what he had not prepared for, was the silence. It wasn't the absence of noise. The hospital still moved around him, distant footsteps, murmured voices, machines doing what machines did. But the space directly ahead of him felt wrong, like stepping into a room where a conversation had just stopped too abruptly. His pace slowed almost imperceptibly as he noticed the men first, positioned with a precision that didn't belong in a place like this, their stillness more threatening than any overt display of force. They weren't dressed like security. They weren't trying to be visible, and yet they were impossible to ignore. Daniel's instincts sharpened, unease threading through the edges of his composure. He adjusted his tie, a reflex more than a necessity, and continued forward, telling himself this was nothing, just an overreaction, just a complication he hadn't anticipated. Hospitals were unpredictable. People showed up. Situations escalated. He could handle this. Then he saw him. Raphael Morty stood near the glass window of a private recovery room, one hand resting lightly against the frame, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested complete control rather than ease. He didn't turn immediately when Daniel approached. He didn't acknowledge him at all at first, as if the man walking toward him didn't yet qualify as something worth noticing. That alone was enough to unsettle Daniel more than any confrontation would have. Recognition hit slowly, like something his mind didn't want to accept but couldn't avoid. The name surfaced first, pulled from half-remembered conversations, from whispered references in circles where people pretended not to be afraid. Raphael Morty. The man people didn't deal with unless they had no other choice. The man whose influence existed just beneath the surface of everything Daniel thought he controlled. For a moment, Daniel considered turning around. The thought was instinctive, immediate, driven by something deeper than logic. But pride held him in place, along with the simple fact that he had already come too far to pretend he hadn't seen what was in front of him. He cleared his throat softly. "I'm here for Alina Carter," he said, keeping his tone steady, professional, as if this were a normal interaction, as if the man in front of him were just another stranger in a hospital hallway. Raphael turned then, slowly, his gaze settling on Daniel with a focus that felt less like observation and more like assessment. It wasn't hostile, not in the way Daniel expected. There was no immediate aggression, no raised voice, no visible threat, just attention, complete, unwavering attention. For a second, Daniel had the unsettling sensation of being understood too quickly, of being reduced to something simple and obvious without a single word being exchanged. "And you are?" Raphael asked. The question was polite, the tone was not. "Daniel Voss," he replied, forcing himself not to look away. "Her husband." The word hung between them, heavy, significant, and for the first time, something in Raphael's expression shifted. Not surprise, not even anger, but recognition of a detail that confirmed something he had already begun to suspect. "I see," Raphael said quietly. Daniel took a step closer, pushing through the unease, clinging to the structure of the situation as he understood it. "I was told she's in recovery. I need to speak with the doctor, understand what happened. There must have been some kind of miscommunication earlier today." "There was no miscommunication," Raphael interrupted, not raising his voice, not moving from where he stood. The interruption itself carried more weight than volume ever could. There was a decision. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "I don't know what you're implying." Raphael's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not implying anything." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with everything Daniel wasn't saying, everything Raphael already knew or was in the process of confirming. Daniel shifted his weight, irritation beginning to edge into his composure. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but this is a private matter, if you'll step aside." Raphael stepped forward instead. It was a small movement, controlled, but it changed the entire dynamic of the space. The distance between them closed just enough to make the difference in presence undeniable. Daniel found himself holding his ground out of sheer stubbornness rather than confidence. "You sent her away," Raphael said, his voice low, almost conversational, but carrying a certainty that made denial feel pointless before it was even spoken. "She went to a facility connected to you. She had symptoms that required immediate attention, and she left without it." Daniel's breath caught, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "That's not what happened," he said quickly, too quickly. Raphael's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened further. "Then explain it to me." Daniel opened his mouth, searching for the version of events that would make sense, that would hold under scrutiny, that would maintain control of the situation. "She came in with minor complaints, stress-related. There was no indication it was anything serious. She insisted on leaving." "Stop." The word wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It cut through Daniel's explanation cleanly, ending it mid-sentence without effort. Raphael took another step closer, and this time Daniel felt it, felt the shift from conversation to something else entirely. Not violence, not yet, but something that made the possibility of it feel very real. "She's pregnant," Raphael said, watching him closely. Daniel's face changed before he could stop it. Not shock, not concern, something else, something closer to calculation. Raphael saw it. And in that instant, whatever doubt might have existed disappeared completely. "You knew," he said softly. Daniel hesitated, just long enough for the truth to settle into the space between them. "It wasn't confirmed," he said finally, the words coming out flatter than intended. "There were possibilities, nothing definite, and even if it had been." "Even if it had been," Raphael repeated, his voice quieter now, more dangerous for it. Daniel straightened slightly, defensive instinct kicking in. "I have a reputation to maintain. My work, my standing, there are complications. Timing matters, appearances matter. I couldn't afford." The sentence never finished. Raphael didn't raise his hand. He didn't touch him. But the silence that followed was so absolute, so heavy, that it felt like something had been physically removed from the air. "You couldn't afford it," Raphael said slowly, as if translating the statement into something clearer, something more honest. "So you let her walk out. You let her carry that risk alone, and when it became inconvenient enough, you ignored it." Daniel's composure cracked, irritation flaring into something sharper. "You don't understand how things work in my world." Raphael held his gaze, unblinking. "No," he said, "I understand exactly how it works." The difference was that in Raphael's world, choices like that didn't get explained. They got answered. And as Daniel stood there, suddenly aware of the men behind him, of the way the hallway had gone quiet again, of the fact that he had walked into something far bigger than he had anticipated, he realized, too late, that whatever control he thought he had over this situation had already been taken from him. Completely. The machines in the recovery room kept a steady rhythm that felt almost artificial, like something rehearsed to convince the world that everything was under control when nothing truly was. Soft beeps, the slow rise and fall of monitored breath, the quiet hum of equipment that existed only to keep people from slipping away unnoticed. Alina Carter lay in the center of it all, pale against white sheets, her body still in a way that didn't belong to her, as if the woman who had once argued with precision and walked away without fear had been temporarily replaced by something fragile and breakable. Raphael stood just inside the doorway, not moving closer at first, not touching anything, not even breathing too loudly. There was something about this space that demanded restraint, something that made even him, who bent rules as easily as other men breathed, pause before crossing the invisible line between control and vulnerability. Behind him, the hallway had been secured without a word. No interruptions, no questions, no one allowed in unless he said so. But inside the room, none of that mattered. Power didn't reach here the same way. For a moment, he simply watched her. The bruising along her arm where IV lines had been inserted, the faint discoloration near her ribs, the way her hand lay slightly curled against the blanket as if it had tried to hold onto something and failed. This was not the Alina he remembered, not the woman who had stood in front of him years ago and told him he was wrong without lowering her voice, without apologizing for it. This was someone who had been left too long without protection, too long without anyone paying attention. And that thought alone was enough to make something inside him tight, dangerously. He stepped closer. It was a slow movement, deliberate, as if approaching something that might break if handled incorrectly. His gaze drifted briefly to the monitors, taking in the numbers, the patterns, the evidence that she was still here, still fighting even if she wasn't aware of it. Then finally, he reached out. His fingers didn't close around her hand immediately. They hovered just above it for a second, a hesitation that would have been unthinkable anywhere else. Then he touched her. Warm, weak, real. The contact grounded something in him that had been shifting since the moment he heard her name. You shouldn't be here like this, he said quietly, the words more to himself than to her, but they filled the room anyway, settling into the silence between machines and breath. You don't lose, not like this. For a long moment, nothing changed. The monitors continued their steady rhythm. The room remained exactly as it had been. And then, almost imperceptibly, her fingers twitched beneath his. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of awakening people imagined. It was small, uncertain, like her body was remembering how to respond before her mind caught up. But Raphael felt it instantly. His grip tightened just enough to confirm it was real. Alina, he said, leaning slightly closer, his voice lowering further, carrying something that hadn't been there before. Not command, not control, something else, something quieter. Stay with me. Her breathing shifted first, uneven for a second before settling again. Then her eyelids fluttered, resisting, fighting through the weight of sedation and pain. When they finally opened, it was only halfway, her gaze unfocused, drifting across the room without recognition. Until it found him. For a second, there was nothing in her eyes but confusion, the disorientation of someone pulled back too quickly from the edge of unconsciousness. Then something clicked. Not fully, not clearly, but enough. No, she whispered, her voice barely more than air. This isn't real. Raphael didn't react to the words. He didn't correct her. He simply held her gaze, steady, present, refusing to disappear. It's real, he said quietly. Her brow furrowed slightly, the effort of thinking visibly painful. You don't come back, she murmured, her eyes struggling to stay open. I left, you do. The sentence broke apart, her breath hitching as the strain caught up with her. You called me, Raphael replied, his tone unchanged, but the words landed with weight. Something in her expression shifted then, something deeper than confusion, something that carried memory with it. Her fingers tightened weakly around his, not with strength, but with intent. I didn't have anyone else, she said, and there was no defense in it, no attempt to soften the truth, just raw honesty delivered through exhaustion and pain. The words hit harder than anything Daniel had said in the hallway, harder than the doctor's report, harder than the sight of her lying here. Not because they were dramatic, because they were absolute. Raphael's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. You should have had better options, he said. A faint, almost humorless breath left her. I used to. The implication lingered between them, heavy and unspoken. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The past sat just beneath the surface, close enough to touch, but neither reaching for it yet. Not here, not now. Her eyes began to close again, the fight to stay awake slipping through her fingers. But before she lost it completely, her grip tightened once more, just enough to hold him there. You're still dangerous, she whispered, the faintest trace of something familiar in her tone, something that almost resembled the woman he remembered. Raphael's expression didn't change, but something in his gaze softened in a way no one else would ever recognize. Yes, he said quietly. Her lips moved slightly, the beginning of something else, maybe a question, maybe a memory, but the words never came. Her hand relaxed, her body giving in again to the pull of sedation, her breathing evening out as sleep took her back under. Raphael remained where he was, his hand still holding hers, his presence unchanged. But something fundamental had shifted. She hadn't called him because she loved him. She hadn't called him because she trusted him completely. She had called him because when everything else was gone, when every safe option had failed, when she had nothing left, he was the only name that remained. And that meant something far more dangerous than either of them had yet acknowledged. Because now that he was here, leaving again was no longer an option. For either of them. The city outside moved as if nothing had changed, headlights cutting through rain-slick streets, people slipping between buildings with ordinary urgency, unaware that inside one guarded hospital room, a quiet decision had just begun to reshape everything. Raphael stood by the window now, his reflection faint against the glass, the sterile light behind him outlining a man who had spent years mastering control and was now standing in a place where control felt dangerously incomplete. Behind him, Alina slept again, but it wasn't the fragile stillness from before. There was something steadier in her breathing now, something that suggested her body had chosen to fight instead of surrender. He didn't turn immediately, didn't check the monitors again, because he already knew she was still there. He could feel it in the room, in the tension that hadn't snapped, in the thread that refused to break. The door opened without a sound because of course it did, and Vincent stepped inside with the kind of silence that came from long practice. He didn't speak right away, didn't ask unnecessary questions, just moved close enough that his voice wouldn't carry. "We've locked down the perimeter," he said, low and precise. "No one gets near this floor without clearance, but there's something you should see." He held out a phone, the screen already lit. Raphael took it without hesitation, his gaze shifting from reflection to evidence in a single motion. The footage was grainy, pulled from an external street camera, timestamped barely 30 minutes before Alina had collapsed. It showed her leaving the building where she lived, walking quickly despite the rain, one hand pressed briefly to her side as if something already hurt. A car idled across the street, headlights off, engine running. The kind of detail most people would miss. The kind of detail Vincent never did. Raphael watched as the passenger door of that car opened just slightly, not enough to attract attention, just enough to signal readiness. Alina didn't look toward it, she kept walking, but her pace changed just a fraction faster, just enough to suggest she knew something wasn't right. The footage cut to another angle, another camera. A figure stepped out of the car now, blurred by distance, but the intent was clear. Not a random passerby, not coincidence. "She was being followed," Vincent said quietly. Raphael didn't respond immediately. His eyes tracked every movement, every shadow, every detail that might reveal more than it was meant to. "Not followed," he said finally, his voice calm in a way that felt more dangerous than anger. "Intercepted." The video continued. Alina stumbled just slightly, her body betraying her before her surroundings could. The figure behind her hesitated, recalculating. Then she collapsed, not from a shove, not from an attack, from whatever had already been happening inside her. The figure froze for half a second, then retreated, slipping back into the car. The vehicle pulled away smoothly as if nothing had happened. Vincent exhaled slowly. Whoever it was, they didn't expect that. "No," Raphael agreed, handing the phone back. "They expected control." His gaze shifted again, this time toward the bed, toward Alina. Someone had been watching her, waiting for something, planning something. And whatever that plan had been, her collapse had interrupted it. Which meant this wasn't over. It hadn't even started. "Run the plate," Raphael said, already knowing Vincent would have done it. "Track the vehicle. I want everything. Ownership, routes, any cameras that caught it before or after. I want to know where it came from and where it went." Vincent nodded, already in motion, "But there's more." He hesitated just briefly, which meant it mattered. "Daniel Carter's finances." That got Raphael's full attention. "What about them?" Vincent's expression didn't change, but his tone shifted slightly, sharpening. "They don't match his profile. He's been moving money recently. Not large amounts, but consistent, structured to avoid attention. And the accounts they're going through," he paused just long enough to let the implication settle. "They're not clean." Raphael turned fully then, the room tightening around the shift in his focus. "You're telling me her husband is involved?" "I'm telling you he's connected," Vincent corrected carefully. "Whether he knows what he's connected to is another question." Raphael's gaze flickered once more to Alina, to the faint rise and fall of her chest, to the woman who had whispered his name instead of her husband's when everything fell apart. "You don't move money like that by accident," Raphael said quietly. "No," Vincent agreed, "you don't." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was calculating, heavy with the weight of possibilities that were already narrowing into something far more dangerous. "If this is tied to whoever was outside," Vincent continued, "then this wasn't random. And if it wasn't random, then she was a target," Raphael finished. The words settled into the room like something alive. Target. Not victim. Not coincidence. Someone had been watching Alina Carter, tracking her movements, positioning themselves for something that hadn't had the chance to unfold. Because she had collapsed first. Raphael moved back to the bed, his hand finding hers again without hesitation, grounding himself in something real while everything else shifted into motion around him. Her skin was still warm, still there, still fighting. They miscalculated, he said softly, almost to himself. Vincent didn't ask what he meant. He didn't need to. Because the implication was clear. Whoever had set this in motion had expected Alina to be alone, unprotected, unnoticed. They hadn't expected her to survive long enough to call anyone. They hadn't expected her to say his name. Raphael's fingers tightened slightly around hers, not enough to wake her, just enough to anchor the promise forming beneath the surface. They wanted control, he said, his voice dropping into something colder, something absolute. Vincent nodded once, and now. Raphael's gaze lifted, no longer on the past, no longer on the footage, but on what came next. Now, he said quietly, they've made it personal. And somewhere in the city, someone who thought they had planned everything perfectly had no idea that the one variable they hadn't accounted for had just stepped into the game. And he didn't lose. The hospital had become something else entirely by morning, no longer a place of healing, but a controlled battlefield hidden beneath fluorescent lights and the quiet hum of machines. Security had doubled without explanation. Nurses moved with an unnatural precision, as if they had been given instructions they didn't fully understand. And every entrance to Alina's floor was now watched by men who didn't belong to any official authority. Raphael stood at the center of it all without raising his voice, without issuing visible commands, yet everything bent around him like gravity had shifted, and anyone with instincts sharp enough could feel it, the kind of presence that didn't ask for control, it assumed it. Alina woke slowly into that pressure, her body still heavy, her thoughts tangled between memory and pain, but the first thing she noticed wasn't the machines or the sterile ceiling. It was the silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that comes when danger is close enough that even the air holds its breath. Her eyes moved, unfocused at first, then sharpening until they found him. Raphael wasn't by the window this time. He was closer, standing near the foot of her bed, speaking in a low voice to Vincent, his expression carved from something harder than calm. She didn't catch the words, but she caught the tone, and it sent a flicker of unease through her that had nothing to do with her condition. When his gaze lifted and met hers, the shift was immediate, almost invisible but unmistakable. The tension didn't disappear, but it changed direction, focusing inward instead of outward. He stepped closer without hesitation, and for a moment everything else in the room felt distant, irrelevant, like background noise fading behind something far more important. "You're awake," he said quietly, his voice carrying a steadiness that felt deliberate. Alina swallowed, her throat dry, her voice fragile but clear enough. "Feels like I've been dragged through something I don't remember agreeing to." It was an attempt at humor, thin but real, and for a second, something almost human flickered in his expression before it vanished again beneath the weight of everything else. "You've been through worse," he replied, though there was no comfort in the words, only truth. Her eyes narrowed slightly, studying him, reading the parts of him that hadn't changed in 3 years and the parts that had become something sharper, more dangerous. "That depends," she said slowly, "on whether whatever's happening now is over or just starting." Vincent shifted slightly at that, his attention flicking between them, but Raphael didn't look away from her. "It's starting," he said, because he didn't lie to her, not about things that mattered. The answer settled into her like a second injury, not physical but just as real, and she felt the instinctive urge to pull back, to retreat into the version of her life where she didn't have to deal with this kind of reality. But that version had never truly existed, and both of them knew it. "What did you find?" she asked, because if she was already inside this, she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Raphael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for a brief moment he considered deflecting, giving her less than the full truth, but something in the way she held his gaze made that impossible. "You were being watched," he said instead, each word measured. "Before you collapsed, someone was positioning for an intercept." Alina's breath caught, not dramatically, not with panic, but with recognition. A quiet, cold understanding that slid into place like a missing piece of a puzzle she hadn't realized she was solving. "Daniel," she said softly, more to herself than to them. Vincent's attention sharpened instantly. "You think your husband is involved?" "I think," Alina said, her voice steadier now, clearer as her mind pushed past the fog of medication, "that nothing in my life has ever been as simple as it looked. And Daniel," she paused, her gaze drifting for a fraction of a second before locking back onto Raphael. "Daniel doesn't move money the way he has been without a reason." Raphael didn't react outwardly, but the confirmation aligned perfectly with what Vincent had uncovered, tightening the pattern into something undeniable. "He's connected to something," Raphael said. "We're still tracing it." Alina let out a slow breath, her hand shifting slightly against the sheet, grounding herself in something physical. "Then you're already behind," she said quietly. Vincent frowned. "Behind?" "They were waiting for something," she continued, her voice gaining strength with every word, the translator in her, the part of her that understood patterns, intentions, and subtext, coming fully awake. "Not me collapsing, that threw them off. Whatever they planned, it depended on timing, on me being exactly where they expected when they expected." She looked at Raphael again, her eyes sharper now, cutting through the haze. "Which means the plan hasn't failed. It's just delayed." The room seemed to tighten around that realization, the implications stretching outward in directions none of them could ignore. Raphael's expression didn't change, but something colder settled behind his eyes, something that suggested the situation had just shifted from controlled to volatile. Vincent swore under his breath. "If that's true, then they'll adjust, they'll move again." "They already are," Alina said, her voice almost calm now, as if stating a fact she had already accepted. "They just don't know how yet." Raphael's gaze didn't leave her, and for the first time since she woke, there was something new there, something that hadn't been present before. Not just concern, not just control, respect, recognition. "You're thinking like them," he said quietly. "I'm thinking like someone who's been underestimated for too long," she replied, and there was no weakness left in her voice now. A sudden sharp sound cut through the room, not loud but distinct enough to shatter the fragile stillness. One of the security radios crackled, followed by a voice that was too controlled to be anything but urgent. "Movement at the east entrance. Unidentified individuals attempting access." Vincent turned instantly, already reaching for his phone. "How many?" "3 confirmed, possibly more outside camera range." Raphael didn't move immediately. He didn't rush, didn't react the way most people would to an immediate threat. Instead, his gaze dropped once more to Alina, to the woman who had just pieced together what others might have missed. "They're adjusting," she said softly, almost echoing her own words. "Yes," Raphael replied, his voice now carrying something final. "And now we see how far they're willing to go." Outside the room, footsteps began to shift, positions tightening, the quiet turning into something sharper, more focused. The hospital, already on edge, was about to become something else entirely. And this time, whatever was coming wasn't waiting for the perfect moment. It was already here. The shift from tension to action was so precise it almost felt rehearsed, like every person on that floor had been waiting for a signal no one had consciously heard. The hospital didn't erupt into chaos. It tightened, sealed, transformed into something quieter and far more dangerous. Doors locked with soft mechanical clicks, footsteps repositioned into strategic patterns, and the sterile calm fractured into controlled readiness. Raphael didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. By the time he stepped into the hallway, everything was already moving in alignment with him. Vincent at his side, Marcus emerging from the far end with a look that meant he'd already assessed the threat and was calculating outcomes. "Alina stays here," Raphael said, not even turning back because it wasn't a suggestion. It was a boundary. "No one in or out except Catherine." Vincent nodded once, already issuing instructions through his earpiece, his tone stripped of anything unnecessary. "Lockdown on room 312. Full coverage. No exceptions." Inside the room, Alina listened to it all, the shift in energy vibrating through the walls, through the air, through her own body that was still too weak to follow but no longer willing to stay blind. The machines beside her kept their steady rhythm, but her pulse had changed, faster now, sharper, driven not by fear but by awareness. She wasn't imagining it anymore. This wasn't paranoia, wasn't coincidence. Someone had come for her and they had chosen the worst possible place to do it. Or maybe, she thought with a flicker of something colder, the best. Her gaze moved toward the door just as Catherine stepped in, closing it quietly behind her, her expression calm in a way that only meant everything outside was not. She crossed the room without hesitation, checking the monitors with practiced efficiency, but her attention settled on Alina almost immediately. "You picked a hell of a day to wake up," she said lightly, though nothing about her eyes was light. "They're here for me," Alina replied, not asking, not guessing, stating it as something she had already accepted. Catherine didn't deny it. "They're here because someone thinks you matter," she corrected softly. "That's worse." Alina let that settle, the weight of it pressing in deeper than the physical pain ever had. How bad? Catherine glanced toward the door, listening to something Alina couldn't hear, then back to her. 3 inside, unknown outside. That means this is either a test or a message. Or both, Alina said. Catherine's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, more like acknowledgement. "You're learning fast." Before Alina could respond, the distant sound of something breaking echoed faintly through the floor, not loud but wrong enough to freeze the air for half a second. It wasn't the chaos of a hospital emergency. It was controlled, deliberate disruption. Catherine's head tilted just slightly, listening, calculating. "They're not rushing," she murmured. "They're probing." Alina's fingers tightened against the sheet, her mind racing ahead of the moment. "They don't expect resistance like this." "No," Catherine agreed. "But they're not amateurs, they'll adapt." In the hallway, Raphael moved like something stripped down to purpose, every step measured, every glance absorbing detail. The east entrance was already secured, 2 of the intruders contained, 1 unaccounted for. Marcus stood near the junction, his presence filling the space like a wall, his voice low as he briefed. 2 confirmed. 1's down, 1's restrained. 3rd slipped past before we sealed the wing. Could be anywhere between here and... "Her room," Raphael finished, his tone dropping into something colder. Vincent's voice cut in through the comms. "We're sweeping. Cameras are glitching in sections. They came prepared." Raphael's jaw tightened. Prepared meant this wasn't random. This wasn't desperation. This was planned. And if it was planned, then the missing piece wasn't lost. It was moving. "Lock every secondary access point," he ordered. "No blind spots." "They already created them," Vincent replied grimly. "Whoever's still out there knows the layout." Raphael didn't respond because that fact had already settled into his mind, aligning with something Alina had said. They were adjusting. They were adapting in real time. Which meant they were closer than anyone wanted to admit. Back in the room, Alina felt it before she heard it. Not a sound, not exactly, but a shift in pressure, a subtle change in the air that didn't belong. Her gaze flicked toward the far wall, toward the secondary door most people would have overlooked because it blended so seamlessly into the structure. It had been closed when she woke. Now it was. Not fully, just enough. Her breath stilled, her body going rigid despite the pain, every instinct sharpening at once. Catherine followed her line of sight instantly, her entire posture changing in a fraction of a second, her hand already moving toward the concealed weapon at her side. "Don't move," Catherine said quietly, her voice losing its softness entirely. The door shifted another inch. Slow. Careful. Not a mistake. Not an accident. A deliberate entry. Alina's pulse thundered in her ears, but her mind didn't break. It focused, narrowed. "They didn't lose him," she whispered. "He was never lost." Catherine didn't answer. Her attention locked on the door as it opened just enough to reveal a shadow slipping through, silent, controlled, precise. For a single heartbeat, everything froze. Then the man stepped fully into the room. And smiled. The smile didn't belong in that room, not under sterile lights or between machines meant to preserve life, and yet it cut through the air with a confidence that suggested the man standing in the doorway had already calculated every possible outcome and decided he could live with all of them. He wasn't dressed like a mercenary or a desperate intruder. He looked almost ordinary, which made him far more dangerous, because nothing about this situation was ordinary. Catherine moved first, her weapon drawn in a motion so fast it barely registered, the muzzle steady, her stance blocking the line between him and Alina without hesitation. "Stop right there," she said, her voice flat, controlled, final. The man didn't flinch. He didn't reach for anything. He simply raised his hand slightly, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement, as if this moment had already been anticipated down to the exact angle of the gun pointed at his chest. "You don't want to shoot me," he said calmly, his gaze sliding past Catherine to Alina with unsettling familiarity. Not before she hears what I have to say. The sound of approaching footsteps thundered faintly down the hallway, Raphael closing in, Vincent not far behind, the entire building tightening toward this single room like a trap snapping shut. Catherine did lower the weapon. "You've got about 2 seconds to start talking," she replied, her finger steady on the trigger. The man's smile softened, not with kindness but with something colder, something almost amused. "Daniel Carter sends his regards," he said. The name hit harder than any physical blow. Alina felt it ripple through her, not as shock, but as confirmation of everything she had already begun to understand. Her husband, the quiet man who had lived beside her, who had shared meals in silence and a life that had always felt slightly out of sync, like something was missing or hidden just beneath the surface. It hadn't been emptiness. It had been concealment. "He doesn't have regards to send," Alina said, her voice low but unwavering. "He doesn't even have the courage to stand in a room like this himself." The man tilted his head as if considering her, then nodded once, almost respectfully. "You always were sharper than he gave you credit for." The door behind him burst open before he could say more. Raphael entering like a force that didn't need momentum to be unstoppable, Vincent at his side, Marcus already sealing the corridor behind them. The temperature in the room seemed to drop not from fear, but from something far more controlled and lethal. Raphael didn't speak immediately. His gaze locked onto the intruder, assessing, measuring, stripping away every layer of pretense in a single look. "You've got 5 seconds," he said quietly, the kind of quiet that carried far more weight than shouting ever could. "Tell me why you're still breathing." The man exhaled slowly as if this was the moment he had been waiting for all along. "Because killing me doesn't stop what's already in motion," he replied. "Daniel isn't just moving money, he's positioning assets, international ones. He's been feeding information to people who don't belong in this city, and tonight," he glanced toward Alina again, the faintest edge of satisfaction returning. Tonight was supposed to be the final confirmation, whether she was still useful or disposable. Raphael's expression didn't change, but something in the room shifted, a line crossed that couldn't be undone. "And you?" Raphael asked. "What are you?" "A messenger," the man said simply, "and a warning. Daniel underestimated 2 things, her." His eyes flicked to Alina. "And you?" Then he smiled again, softer now, almost like a closing statement. "He won't make that mistake again." Catherine didn't wait for further permission. The shot was precise, controlled, ending the conversation before it could stretch into anything more dangerous. The man dropped instantly, the silence that followed heavier than the sound of the gun itself. For a moment, no one moved. Then Raphael stepped forward, his attention already shifting beyond the body, beyond the room, toward the implications that were still unfolding. "He's not running a small game," Vincent said quietly, breaking the silence. "This is bigger than local power. If he's bringing in outside players, then this becomes a war," Marcus finished. Alina pushed herself up slightly, ignoring the protest of her body, her gaze steady on Raphael. "Not if we end it before it starts," she said. He turned to her, and for the first time since this began, there was no hesitation, no question in his expression, only certainty. "We will," he replied. What followed wasn't chaos. It was strategy. Within hours, Daniel Carter's accounts were frozen, his contacts exposed, his network dismantled piece by piece with a precision that left no room for recovery. The people he had aligned with, outsiders who thought they could slip into a city already controlled, found themselves cut off, isolated, eliminated without spectacle but with undeniable finality. There was no prolonged battle, no drawn-out conflict. Just a swift, decisive removal of a threat that had been building in shadows too long. Daniel was found 2 days later, not dead, but broken in a way that mattered more. Stripped of power, of leverage, of the illusion that he had ever truly been in control. He didn't beg. He didn't fight. He simply looked at Alina when they brought him in, something hollow in his expression, something that might have been regret if it hadn't come too late. "I was trying to build something bigger," he said, his voice thin, almost unrecognizable. Alina studied him, the man she had once believed she knew, and felt nothing. Not anger, not sorrow, just clarity. "You built nothing," she said quietly. "You destroyed everything you had." He didn't answer, because there was nothing left to say. The world didn't change overnight, but it shifted in ways that mattered. The threat that had come for her ended not with chaos, but with precision, with control reclaimed and reinforced. And Alina, Alina changed in ways that couldn't be undone. She didn't return to the life she had before, because that life had never truly existed. Instead, she stepped forward, not as someone dragged into a world she didn't understand, but as someone who had seen it clearly and chosen not to look away. Weeks later, when the hospital was just a memory and the city had settled back into its usual rhythm, she stood beside Raphael on a quiet rooftop overlooking everything they had protected, everything they had fought for. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't said your name?" she asked softly. He didn't hesitate. "You wouldn't be here," he said. She nodded once, accepting the truth of it, then looked out over the city again. "Then I guess I chose correctly." Raphael's hand found hers, steady, certain, the same way it had in that hospital room when everything had been uncertain. "You didn't just choose," he said quietly. "You changed the outcome." Below them, the city moved on, unaware of how close it had come to something far worse, unaware of the war that had almost begun and the woman who had stopped it before it could take shape. Elena Carter had walked into that hospital alone, bleeding, forgotten, whispering a name she wasn't supposed to remember. Elena Morty walked out of this story something else entirely. Not a victim, not someone saved, but someone who had stepped into the fire and decided she would never be powerless again. And this time, if the world came for her, it would learn exactly what that meant.